I'm going to start again. Okay, I'm going to start again. I'm sorry. Framework of this course is, and the basic purpose of it is the belief that we are, as a species and as a culture, experiencing a crisis of belonging. And that we live within a culture of this belonging, which is what I'm calling the paradigm of narcissism, which affects us at every level of our life. And I think that we're in that position for there's sort of two levels of that. One is, as in the nature of our species, we have apparently a special vulnerability to not belong. That does not seem to be the case for squirrels and trees and hawks. And we'll talk a little more about that when we talk about the structure of the human brain and the evolution of the human brain. But we have a vulnerability to that. And one way to notice that we have that vulnerability is that throughout human history, there have been both cautionary tales and rituals and rites to help us be be in sync with the rest of life and to find our belonging. So that includes, for instance, in Native American things, the stories of Coyote, who's a mischief maker and a troublemaker, and he's treated with humor, but it's also humor about our tendency to mess things up due to our curiosity and our pride. The story of Icarus, which is inventing something that we think allows us to fly to the sun. Then the wax melts and we crash to the ground. The story of Pandora's box, our curiosity, loosing the ills and pains of the world. Our culture's story of Eden, which I think there's a lot of ways to look at that, but one way to look at it is it's our loss of our primal belonging as an integrated part of nature. And something about the tree of knowledge, something about our way of knowing and understanding things is what got us expelled. So that the sense that there's some primal belonging that animals and trees and rocks have that we are in some level expelled from, and we have to find our way back to. And then there's also rites and rituals like initiations and rites and intonations, which are designed to help us come in alignment with the larger cycles of nature and find our place within it. And of course, there's also Mickey Mouse in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, who is an ancient symbol of what happens if we get too big for our britches. So so that's one. I think as a species, we have a vulnerability to it. But then on top of that, of course, we are a species that creates and is largely shaped by our culture, and whose culture evolves and makes a big difference in who we are. And our present culture is one that celebrates our separation from and our dominance over and our entitlement in relationship to nature and the rest of the world. I'm calling that the paradigm of narcissism. There's many things one could call it. You could call it the paradigm of empire in its modern form. It's not the only empire, but the current empire would be an empire of capitalism. You can call it patriarchy, colonialism, dominator. That many people have talked about this in many ways and from many perspectives. But I'm calling it narcissism because how the course is structured, I'm interested in starting from the individual psychological and taking it then up to the bigger picture. So narcissism is the word for it on the individual psychological level. And also narcissism is obviously a very poignant and interesting concept for us at this moment in our political history. So the paradigm of narcissism is basically one form or another of the view that life is fundamentally a contest of opposing interests. that if you want to understand the fundamental structure of life, that's what it is. It's a contest of opposing interests. And that's on the individual level, individuals against each other, on races, classes, nations, species. That's the best way to understand what's going on. And what I'm saying is that there's a transition that's being required of us. And that transition is essentially to what I'm going to call a paradigm of communion, which is essentially the understanding that we're all in the same boat. And we is the big we, namely everything, not just individuals, not just humans, everything. So the dominant metaphors of the narcissistic paradigm are separateness, competition, conflict, struggle for dominance, dominance and submission, power over, power against, hierarchy. Certainly to the extent that the hierarchy is based on power. And in some way, one of the things intellectually, structurally about that is that it's a, and we'll talk much more about this, but it's a model of atomism, which is that the way to understand the world is to break it down to its little parts, and that the world is the sum of the parts. That if you want to understand the world, you look at the parts, and the parts create the world. The dominant and then the paradigm of communion would be one of holism as opposed to atomism, that would say it's not just true that the little parts explain the whole, it's also that the whole shapes and explains the parts, that the whole has a causal effect on the parts, and that causality goes both ways, rather than simply thinking we understand things when we break it down to the parts, and then think that the sum of the parts, that the whole is simply the sum of the parts. But among the metaphors for the dominant, among the metaphors for the paradigm of communion is relationship, cooperation, interdependence, dialogue, conversation, co-creation, a chorus, a web, the web of life, a mutuality of dependence and support. Now, like any paradigm, and we could talk a little more about paradigms in general, but like any paradigm, both of those parts have truth to them. Both of them have truth to them. But what I'm saying is that in our present paradigm, the balance between those two things is hugely out of balance, and that balance is costing us terribly. So our present culture, whether you want to call it narcissistic culture or capitalistic culture or whatever, capitalism is not the first or only oppressive system, it's just the one we're in. It celebrates separation and competition as the ruling principle of society, and thereby it celebrates, cultivates, replicates, and brings forth those qualities and those potentials in the human beings that are part of that society. And it is blind to and neglects the connectedness of things, therefore blind to our need to both be grateful to and to be productive contributors to the whole. And in its blindness, it's ultimately delusional, and it becomes delusional at the point when we are so blind that it's affecting our ability to survive. So just to be clear, I'm defining belonging as a way to find the proper balance between being fully oneself and being connected, a balance between those. So belonging is both everything that exists to belong has to, first of all, be itself, stand up for its own existence, and express its potential as fully as it can. To have a place, have to be you, and to find one's proper place within the web of life that's grateful to and respectful of the rest of existence, and that's able to receive and offer nurturance to the whole, receive nurturance from the whole and contribute to the nurturance of the whole. Now, on the species level, that balance is called a niche. On the society level, you could call that being a good citizen. On the family level, you could say it's being an empowered and nurturing member of the family. In family therapy, you're not trying to foster someone erasing themselves and just be pulling back and just trying to do whatever everybody else needs from them, which is not healthy. But you're also to be and express themselves, but also to be able to be respectful of and contribute to the welfare of the other folks in the family. Now, the system of narcissism loves polarities. It exploits them. It infinitely replicates them. And narcissism never saw a polarity that it doesn't like. Now, about polarities in general, polarities are necessary. It's how we map. We can talk more about this later, but polarities are how we map reality. There's up, there's down, there's left, there's right, north, south, west, east. There's hot, there's cold, there's good and bad, feels good, we need polarities as a way to map and understand reality, and we use them all the time. But there is no one polarity that explains all of reality. Any point in the world is actually can be mapped on an infinite number of polarities. And in that way, polarities are really an intellectual concept. They're a mental construct, and they are always a simplification or an abstraction or a reduction of the complexity of the whole. And which is often expressed as the fact that the map is not the territory. Doesn't mean maps aren't useful. And in fact, I'm offering a polarity, namely the paradigm of narcissism versus the paradigm of communion. And the question then about that polarity is, it's obviously a simplification of reality and a reduction of the complexity of reality. And then it's either useful or it's not. So it's not that polarities are bad, but we need to understand that polarities are, like I said, their way of mapping, and the map is not the territory. So I'm going to take one polarity, and let's call it, on the one hand, to be fully oneself, and on the other, to be connected. Now, so the solution to a polarity, I'm going to get this in my hands, in the picture both. The solution to a polarity is not, on the one hand, so from the narcissistic view, a polarity is a contradiction and opposition, and the solution is to have the side of the polarity that you like win and get rid of the other side. Is victory of one side of a polarity over the other. The other thing that is not a solution to a polarity is a compromise. So it's not like, I don't know, what's an example? Let's say all the old people in our society are starving because we don't take care of them. And so one person says, well, we need to take care of it could be any part, we need to take care of our people. And the other side says, no, everybody's responsible for themselves. So the solution is not, well, let's take care of half of our people, because that's a compromise. That might be how it would work in Congress, but that's not a solution. The solution to the polarity is to find the underlying truth that transcends the polarity, that holds the polarity. And I'm in this case proposing that subsumes the polarity. So in this case, I'm proposing belonging as an underlying, as the underlying transcendence of the polarity between being oneself and being connected. And it's basically, because that's a deeper truth. It's a deeper truth than any one of the poles of the reality. An example of that would be in individual psychology, where if you made a polarity, say, which is common in art culture, of, say, being selfish or being self-sacrificing, right? In that polarity, it implies that the more I care about myself, that those are opposite, right? That being selfish is the opposite of sacrificing and of helping and being connected. And the deeper psychological truth is that being connected to yourself, having access to your own authentic self, having access to your own emotional authentic self, is not in contradiction to, but is a condition of being able to be available to connect intimately with the authentic self of someone else. So that would be an example where, yeah. So, and here's an example of that. I'm facilitating a grief group for people who've had unbelievable traumatic loss. But that loss is often compounded for them by the fact that some of their closest and most important people to them cannot tolerate the loss of their loss, and therefore removes themselves in one way or another. And then they feel betrayed and alone because some important people can't be there for them for their loss. And what that's about is that if those people are not able to countenance and experience and have some kind of relationship to their own grief, if I'm terrified of my own grief and don't feel like I can afford to feel it, because if I do, I'm going to be destroyed and fall apart and sink into an infinite deep hole. If that's my relationship to my own grief, I cannot be there for you for yours. And I will have to either, try and cheer you up or tell you not to be sad or tell you to get over it, or just cut off my relationship with you. And that's what has happened a lot to those folks. All right. I'm now going on to the structure of the class. And so the paradigm, the narcissistic paradigm, can be mapped as a series of concentric circles, where each circle represents a sphere that is a microcosm and a macrocosm. It's a bunch of nested microcosms and macrocosms, which is my way of wanting to be able to talk about the fact that the same, that the narcissistic paradigm influences us at each level of our life, and that we can resist it and try and heal it and transcend it at every level of our life. Now, again, that's a map, right? And it's a primitive map, because a much better map would be not concentric circles, but a spiral, because of course these spheres relate to and affect each other. But for the purpose of the structure of this class, I'm thinking of concentric, a map that uses concentric microcosms and macrocosms as a way to approach it. And so working from the inside out, there's the intrapsychic, which is how we treat ourselves internally and how we treat the parts of ourselves internally. There's the interpsychic, which is how we relate to others, other individuals. Then there's how we relate to other groups, other species, nature, the planet, spirit. So the the next class, we may get to some of that this class, but the next class is going to be, of course, so that would be class 3, will be the sphere of psychological development. How does narcissism operate on the individual level? How does it get created developmentally? How do we heal it? How do we raise our kids so they're not narcissists? How do we accept the normal levels of narcissism in ourselves, but prevent that from going to the pathological level? So week 3, the individual psychology development. The next one I want to talk about the economic level. And the reason, besides that I'm an economist, among other things, is that I do that is because when I study economics, I realized that at each level, from high school to college to graduate school to PhD program, at each level, they were saying exactly the same thing. The only thing that changed was the level of mathematical sophistication with which they modeled it. But they were always saying the same thing, and that what they were saying was essentially a template for the ideological structure of capitalist society and a justification for it. So it's a really nice place to see clear and simple the ethos. And it's also a place where I would like to, I think, people who are emotionally upset with the way things are or want to change things, most people don't have an economics background. So point is, I'd like to leave everyone with a really good toolkit for how to answer and respond to that ideology and how it gets used. Week 5, I want to talk about evolution and our relationship with nature. And it's also a place where the dominant paradigm sees evolution purely as a contest and competition. And while that is a part of what's going on, it tends to be very blind to and minimize the role that cooperation has played as being a evolutionary effective quality that gets passed on. I want to then talk about the political, which would be how our political system creates and exploits and depends on division, because it's that division that allows a democratic society to have such a supposedly democratic society to have such unequal distribution of power and influence and resources. Class 6 is going to be about the brain and about integrating sort of the function of the human brain, and such that our executive function is respectful of and in service of some of the more ancient and older and emotional and non-intellectual parts of our being, so that it can be just if it's a right, if our executive function is sort of our rider and it's sort of our newfangled evolutionary, relatively newfangled function, how does that rider be a rider who respects, listens to, and serves the wisdom that the horse has to offer, rather than dominate it? And I think some of the worst things we do is when we follow an intellectual path in the way that we're numb to the consequences of which. I guess a great example would be Eichmann saying, "I was just following orders," and it was just an efficiency issue, how to get the most Jews and other Jews and socialists and gay folks and whoever we didn't like to the concentration camps. But it's just an efficient issue, and the question of, it had nothing to do with hating anyone. It was just an intellectual problem. And then I want to talk, 7th class, I want to talk about science and spirituality. which is, I think, one of the great false dichotomies that is propagated. So I want to, the point then being that on each of these levels to talk about how the narcissistic paradigm affects us on that level, how to resist and heal and outgrow it, and how to move on to something new. Maybe we'll take a break and, well, I mean, I have a little more I want to say about paradigms and how they work, but let's just see if anyone has something they want to say in response to this. And I'm going to go to the group view.
Bob, are you using paradigm in the same way as worldview?
Yeah, except it's not just intellectual. So it's a worldview, but it's also a worldview that is takes shape in institutions and structures, physical structures and political institutions and systems of power. So it's not purely an intellectual piece, but from the intellectual side, yeah, worldview I think is a good. It gets concretized, is what I'm saying, you know, in institutions and structures. Well, I'll say a little more about paradigm then. So saying that it's a paradigm, I want to say, is on the one hand, the bad news is it sort of has us surrounded, right? If we're saying it operates consciously and unconsciously in every aspect of our life, that's pretty alarming. The positive side of that is I think it can be resisted at every level. And one of the hopes of this course is, you know, there used to be an old, in the 60s and 70s movement, there was this thing about, oh, you got to change society first so that people can be free, and other people would say you got to change people first. You can't change society unless you start with changing the people, which is another nice false dichotomy. And so one of my hopes is that by saying that it can be resisted at every level, that it sort of respects the very different interests, talents, knowledge, whatever, that everyone, each of us might have, and that there are many ways to contribute to the change, and that we can each sort of find the way that seems to fit who we are and uses what we have to offer in the best possible way. So so that's sort of the good news of that. But the other really, really, really important good news is because when you're inside of, and again, this is what's going on right now in the world. There are beautiful things being born, you know, and beautiful ways of living a good life and that help us live a good life, some of which we're developing now, some of which are ancient, and the you know, there's I've always been a you know, long history of shaman and midwives and spiritual leaders and whatever else that have stood up for the communion of life. So this doesn't describe the whole thing, it's just an attempt to describe the problem. But the other bit of good news is that paradigms also have a life cycle, and that paradigms are born and they develop and they grow and they die and they give birth to something new, just as human beings and trees and rocks and everything else. So each paradigm is born when the previous paradigm is missing so much of reality and is working so badly that something new has to get born. And each new paradigm reveals a parts of truth and a part of reality that was hidden or not understood or not adequately addressed in the paradigm before it. So for instance, if we talk about the transition from the medieval paradigm to the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment was a assertion of the sacredness of the individual self and the individual soul and the individual spirit that was not recognized by a medieval structure that was all about a hierarchy that God had created, and that system was justified by the fact that you played your ordained role in the existing system, and that left most of humanity abused and disrespected and used. So the idea of the sacredness of the individual spirit was a hugely progressive idea and the foundation of the Enlightenment and the foundation of everything since then, including the culture that we're in. And the idea of the sacredness of the individual is one that at this point in our culture has reached the point where it includes the sacred right of us to abuse and misuse nature, the sacred right of corporations to pollute, the sacred right of me to infect other people. You name it, the idea of freedom used as a justification for not being responsible for the effect of one's actions on the whole. So that's just it. So there's a progressive idea that's progressive at one point in history and at some point is no longer, at least not in an unbalanced form. So each paradigm reveals new truths that haven't been recognized adequately or served adequately in the previous one. Each new paradigm allows a whole new way of thinking and a whole new set of institutions and possibilities, and supports a whole reality that was not possible in the previous paradigm. And that, in this case, it includes, all the scientific discovery and all the knowledge and all the power and all the ability to shape the physical world that we have accumulated. Every paradigm has blind spots, and those blind spots, the cost of those blind spots accumulate, and the costs come due over time and become clear over time. They're revealed over time. And when those costs become too high, that's when a new paradigm, there's the potential for the birth of a new paradigm, a new way of living, a new way of looking at the world. And it's not just a way of looking at the world, it's a way of being in the world, and it will take material, it'll be manifested in social institutions and structures. So our challenge is that the costs of the narcissistic paradigm have become apparent and unsupportable. And our challenge is, can we create a transition to something new? Which, among other things, means, can we take responsibility for the enormous and growing powers to affect the world that we have that our ancestors did not? Can we take responsibility for that power, use it for good? Can we use our gifts? Can we be ourselves and use our gifts in a way where we can become good and beautiful citizens of creation and contributing citizens of creation? And it's when I say that, I think about it, it's kind of like we're in adolescence as a culture, right? Because in adolescence, you basically, that part of life is about differentiating yourself and separating yourself and asserting yourself and creating yourself and being yourself. And partly you need to do that because you don't have hardly any power in the world, because you don't want the world to define you and subsume you. And then at some point, as we get older, we start to realize, you know what, we actually do have a power and effect in our lives, in the world. We do affect other people. And we do need to take responsibility, recognize our power and take responsibility for the power that we have, so that our power is used in a constructive and useful way. So in some ways, what we're faced with as a culture is growing up. And the fact that growing up seems on all the levels we look at it to be in some way a natural process, that doesn't mean it's guaranteed or that we can't screw it up. But the fact that growing up is a natural process, I seem to find that as hopeful, that there's a natural tendency in the world and in us that we can try to manifest and build on and express. That's the end of my rap. What if we take a little break right now? Come back in, well, let me look at the clock here. It's almost 2. How about a 5-minute break and we all come back and then we share about this, whatever we're thinking about it. And then, so I want to do some sharing, and then I also want to do a little experiential thing that'll be the beginning of experiential stuff that is going to be one of the other strands that I want to weave into this class. Okie doke. See you in 5.
Bob.
Who just said Bob?
Verily. I wanted to apologize. A friend needed some help and it was much longer than I expected. I'm so sorry for coming in late.
Well, helping a friend is a really good thing to do. So congratulations on doing that.
Thank you.
Okay. So I am, this is being taped, and actually I realize I need to stop the recording as soon as we're finished talking. So this will be available in tape once I figure out, it is taped, and once I figure out how to get the tape to people in a way where you can play it. Yeah, absolutely. Let's have a discussion.
Okay, so my question is paradigms. Are you speaking of a world paradigm or a cultural paradigm in which we live here in the United States, or both, or what?
Yeah, that's good. Well, I was thinking about us in the United States, but it's also the paradigm of multinational capitalism, and therefore of what's sometimes called the New World Order. And it's a system that is spreading and increasingly dominating the world, and then it comes up against very different paradigms, and some of which are very ancient. Some people who are living in ways that people have lived for much more of human history than our present paradigm. I mean, our present paradigm is this little blip in human history. And it does a lot of damage and harm, and it's essentially the whole world at some level has to respond to that. I actually think that some of the nationalism around the world, which unfortunately in third world countries, a lot of the nationalism used to be what I call progressive, But a lot of the nationalism, which includes also now a lot of right-wing nationalism, a lot of nationalism, I think, is people responding to the fact that their nations, including the developed nations like in Europe, the nation state has not stood up to multinational corporations, which extend way beyond the powers of the nation state. And that there's a hunger for a national identity in a nation state. That can take distorted forms, but it's also a reflection of the fact that the nation state is one of the sources that has the potential to speak up for the people in that nation. And but the problem is for that to work, the nation states, instead of competing for attracting international capitalism, would have to organize themselves together in order to insist, for instance, that all of the rights of, that for instance, the European social contract doesn't get rescinded in the process of trying to compete for international corporations. But of course, the collision of our paradigm and the imperial ones before it, right, with native peoples and with the genocide of native peoples and native ways of living, is one of the great horror stories of the paradigm. But I am starting, I guess, from thinking about home, because that's the place where we hopefully can have some impact, and it's where we live.
So I've always used this terminology, collective consciousness.
Mhm.
If you look back in history, there's been a collective consciousness in different areas of the world that coincide with each other, and changes happen simultaneously before the era of us being able to communicate with other peoples and nations around the world. And there's been a collective consciousness that's been recorded that certain changes happen simultaneously around the globe. And I'm wondering how that really fits, that collective consciousness fits with paradigms, because we have indigenous people who are still living the old ways,
Yeah.
and the ways in which they honor all life, the rock people, the tree people, all of the people. And so, I mean, it'd be nice if that collective consciousness took over, but it hasn't. So anyways, just the comparison between collective consciousness and paradigms, maybe.
Yeah. Well, those obviously are important places of resistance and transformation, and they're also, there's also a pool of wisdom about how to live that hopefully can, that there's a cross, that can nurture the changes that are being made sort of from within the paradigm.
Well, I think in looking at our history, that the paradigm has changed with, I'm thinking about the women's situation, what it was like at the beginning of our country and where we are today in terms of we're not equal to men, but we're certainly a lot better off and we can vote. Now I see that part of our development as a real positive, and I see that very slowly happening in third world countries and places where women are beginning to realize that they do have some power. I mean, and that, so I see little parts of our paradigm. You and I see paradigms so differently. But I do see that little parts of it. I mean, I think of the history of the Blacks in our country. Granted, they're not equal either, but where they were and where they are now, I mean, there's movement that I see happening that's positive in our culture. I agree with you. I see a lot of our materialism and commercialism and moving into third world countries. And I see that in, I don't know how many years, they're going to be very similar to where we are now. And that's going to create tremendous, separation, just like we have. And I don't think that is good, but I do see some good things happening from our history being projected in all kinds of other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I mean, I see those things as forces of transformation, evolution and out of the dominant paradigm. And that's why I said, you can call the dominant paradigm patriarchy, would be a way of looking at it. And you could call it, certainly racism is a part of it. So, I'm trying to use the concept of a paradigm to generalize what the problem is and to situate the various struggles against racism, against sexism, against economic exploitation, against environmental disruption, to sort of situate those as allied counterforces and allied forces of transformation that are operating and being born within it. So to the extent that the way I've been talking about it makes it sound like the paradigm is a fixed thing, or like that it isn't already in the process and hasn't been already for a long time in the process of birthing its heirs. I think that's great. That's really important to say that within this paradigm, there are tremendous forces for a birth of something new and better. And that the more we can see those different forces as in alliance and part of the same solution to one way of looking at it, to the same problem. So for instance, so we don't have people fighting against racism, arguing with people who are fighting against class oppression, arguing with people who are fighting against sexism, but to see those as one struggle and one struggle against a whole unified system of not only understanding people and their relationships, but also of institutions that concretize that view. So
the one struggle I see that kind of lags way behind is the gay rights movements. They're way behind, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they are way behind, but that's certainly.
They're way behind. Go to Nebraska.
Yeah.
They're behind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all kinds of oppression are essentially not ways of not understanding that we're all in it together. And if those different oppressions are competing with each other, which has happened a lot,
Yes.
for which one is more important and which one is better, rather than being in alliance with each other, then we're serving the system.
I think if we don't mention them all,
Yeah,
some can get left out.
yeah, absolutely. And for them, yes, right. And then for them to assert themselves, but for that to be seen, that assertion is being seen as an inclusion and an and rather than a but.
Yes, there's a cooperation. We're all
Yeah.
working for those together, yes.
Yeah. And there've been in this 70s movement, there was a lot of harm done, I think, by people who saw, there was one debate essentially where people saw things all in terms of class issues and felt like that explained everything. And the talking about race is, the Black people's struggle as something separate was divisive of, a unified class position. And what that did was essentially be blind to the particular situation of Black folks. And then there were elements in the Black movement who led in an understanding that Black oppression and class oppression were not in contradiction, were part of the same problem, rather than debating which oppression was more important or something. Yeah.
I like your idea of looking for the commonality in all of these issues rather than just to look at one. I think that's where the answer is in the commonality.
Yeah.
And by looking at paradigm, I can see the commonalities more. And I think the awareness of the separate problems is important too, but then to bring them together with the commonality.
Yeah. Right. So for instance, when for people who said, oh, it's all class struggle and that's, everything else is minor, and that what that meant was that the people, Black people and gay people and women and whoever, felt invisible and therefore replicated, the dominant culture's disrespect and ignoring and oppression of various groups. Yeah. It's good stuff. I like what people are adding.
Well, and I think when it comes to the biggest problem for me is the environment. It doesn't really matter. All those groups need to come together, and that's, to me, our biggest problem. So many other problems don't matter if we don't have a globe,
I agree, but it's also, I think it's been important that one of the things that's limited the environmental movement is when it's been seen as a privileged movement of people who, you can afford about the environment. You're not, you're not dying of starvation, or you're not blah, blah, blah. You're not suffering some of the oppression.
I was thinking of that just in our country. I was thinking of that just as a national issue rather than global.
Right.
I really.
But even national.
I mean, we are privileged. We are.
But even nationally, there's been a really good development, I think, in the ecology movement that said that understands that environmental issues, first of all, impact the least privileged people the most, but also that the solutions have to be ones that are that support economic justice and social justice, rather, which means essentially we're back to then uniting those issues. Otherwise, the environmental movement becomes isolated as a privileged movement. But I think there's been that's one of the places where I think there's been some great progress in the ecological movement in the environmental movement to say, whatever solutions we come up with, they have to address social justice. So that's a good example. It was, again, in this picture, I would be very sad if somehow I'm not acknowledging the growth that has happened. And that's a really important one right there.
I'd like to raise the point that on Earth Day, it would be really useful to show some very significant films across the country on every channel. And one of them would be the Earth from Space, which is absolutely fabulous program on the interconnectedness of everything on this Earth. That's one. The second one would be The Greatest Little Farm. Another
Yeah.
one,
Yes.
Boundaries by David Attenborough and A Life on the Planet. And
Yes.
Kiss the Ground is another one. So if we could
Yes.
get even our politicians all to watch all those films on one single day, it would do more to bring an understanding on a very visceral level
Yeah.
to all of us than all the talk in the world.
Yep.
Because basically, in a very, very distinct way, it shows the interrelatedness of everything that is. And you cannot do anything without affecting the whole.
Yeah.
Would it be useful for you to send links to the group about those, or does everybody sort of know how to access those?
Okay. Attenborough's are on Netflix.
Yep.
I think they're all on the
Yeah,
Netflix. Nova is The Earth from Space. And that's a one.
We're not going to remember all the names of them.
I'll
So
put
you know
them
what,
in.
once
Maybe
you
you could just send us the names of them and then
Yeah.
we could find them.
just send an email with the names of things that you don't have to necessarily come up with links unless that's easy, but yeah, the names of what you're recommending.
Okay, do we have that email list yet?
Well, the emails that I've sent out has everybody on it.
Okay, great. Great, I will do that.
You just copy
Because
that.
those-
You just copy the address that I sent.
And this is another one from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they are very active in teaching children about racial justice and
Yeah.
tolerance. And it's beautiful.
Oh my, we are about out of time. So I am not going to do the exercise, or I can do it for whoever wants to stay. Let me say that next time we're going to talk about the psychological and developmental aspect of this, and that's fear. And I'm going to send you an email with some books that I recommend to read about that. One of them is a book called Narcissism, The Denial of the True Self by Alexander Lowen. And he is a student of Wilhelm Reich and sort of one of the founders of body-oriented and emotionally oriented therapy. And the other is sort of my favorite book as a sort of introduction to therapy. It's actually written for therapists, but I think it's very understandable. It's called The Transforming Power of Affect, The Transforming Power of Affect by Diana Fosha, F-O-S-H-A. But I will send you those books. This is just for these, not only are they not required, and it's not necessary to read these before the class or anything like that. But if you're more interested in that topic or want to do some reading either before or after, those would be two books that I think connect well with what I'm trying to say. And next time we'll be sure to get to some experiential stuff, which will be essentially, we'll start with essentially a meditation, which is about connecting to the life force in yourself, connecting to an experience, the process of life in yourself. If anyone wants to stay, we can do that. Take for 10 minutes for those who want to stay, but everyone else is invited to come and be here next week.